Hi, everybody. I see some familiar faces. I'm really excited that you're all here. I'm going to start with a short introduction to our speaker, Saba Gul, who's going to be talking about building socially scalable tech. But first, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Saima Akhtar. I'm the Associate Director of the Vagelos Computational Science Center at Barnard College. And as part of the Year of Science, we're hosting a diversity in computing speaker series, which just kicked off the beginning of this semester. And so Saba is actually our last speaker for the fall. The series runs for the entire academic year, so we'll be continuing again in spring, and features talks from scholars and practitioners in computational fields who explore what diversity, equity, and inclusion look like in STEM. The idea for the series emerges out of an urgent need to more fully consider the ethical and social implications of computing and its applications. For example, in designing addictive social media platforms or in using AI for facial or name recognition, which can lead to housing discrimination, racial biases in job hiring, or restrictions on personal freedoms through public and private surveillance, to name a few. To better understand how to counter these biases, this series attempts to rethink STEM disciplines from the inside out. We invite one speaker every month to speak about the work they're doing to diversify and broaden inclusion in their fields by either sharing their research and experiences or their thoughts on how power structures within computing disciplines or the field should be transformed to create more equitable systems. And with that, I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Saba Gul, who is a technologist and entrepreneur who has built digital products and startups across geographies, including the US, Europe, South Asia, and East Africa. Previously, she was the founder and CEO of Pop&J, an e-commerce startup with a supply chain spanning Pakistan, Vietnam, and China. She has been part of two teams that build the engineering core for billion-dollar companies and helped launch companies in diverse sectors such as health, e-commerce, mobility, and logistics. In 2019, she led the design and development of a first-of-its-kind AI-driven platform for the Gates Foundation to reduce South Asian infant mortality. Saba was also a graduate researcher in the Genesis Group at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab, where she built computational models of how humans tell, perceive, and understand stories. She is a World Economic Forum Global Shaper, a US State Department Generation Change Fellow, and speaks frequently on entrepreneurship and gender at forums like the UN, World Bank, Harvard Business School, and TEDx events. Saba was raised in Pakistan and holds Bachelor of Science and Master of Engineering degrees from MIT. Saba, the floor is yours.
Hi. Thank you so much, Saima, for that intro. I am going to start by sharing my screen. So I want to start by sharing how deeply excited I am to be talking to this audience today of what I am told mostly young individuals still finding their way through tech, particularly young women. So I hope this talk will give you questions to reflect on, but also ideas and solutions for how to sort of chart your own path through tech at a time when there is a lot of focus on the industry, both negative and positive. And with that, I also want to let you know that if this talk gets heavy, there is exit on your left and your right. I mean, this is a topic that is very close to my heart, but also I joke about how heavy it can be as well. And I appreciate everyone who's here who really wants to learn more, despite how this topic can be, distressful as well if you really get into it. So I want to start by setting context for myself, I think especially for people who are at the start of their trajectory in tech. And my journey starts in Pakistan. I was born and raised there, and I came to MIT as an undergrad when I was 18. And interestingly over there, my undergrad thesis advisor was Sinan Aral, who is now one of the leading social media researchers in leading voices on social media and its role in the world. He's written a book called The Hype Machine, which I really recommend. And I spent some time doing tech internships and study abroad programs across the world in places like Sri Lanka, where I built a technology sort of infrastructure and database project that we did after the Southeast Asian tsunami in 2005. I spent some time at INRIA in Paris, which is sort of the National Center for Computer Science for France, and published my first paper there. And then spent some time in Addis Ababa teaching computer science to undergrads at the University of Addis Ababa. And then from there went on to do my first full-time roles at companies like Oracle and Thomson Reuters in enterprise software. So, this up until this point, I feel like my journey was pretty standard. I mean, not super conventional as far as, I guess, coming from Pakistan to a place like MIT was concerned, especially in 2001. 2 weeks after actually 9/11 happened, which is a story for its own day. But, it still was sort of, for someone who was an international student at MIT, pretty, standard route to working in tech, working in different areas and parts of the world. But what I really want to, reflect on is this sort of inflection point that happened after I went back to MIT for my master's degree, worked with Patrick Winston and the Genesis Group on computational models for storytelling. And then from that point, this exclamation mark that you see was this inflection point that was unusual, because I chose to start a startup, which was ethical e-commerce focused on, artisans, particularly low-income populations in Pakistan, Vietnam, and China. And that was unusual for someone with my background. And also sort of quitting my job in 2008 at the height of the, right after the economic recession was unusual. And so I'm going to say a word or two after about that. I think that really connects to the talk today, in fact, about my hesitations about tech and about my challenges in finding the type of work that I was looking for in tech. But since then, I ran the startup for 4 years. And since then, I went back and charted my own path through tech at a company called Venture Dive, where I was part of 2 teams that built unicorn companies, and then worked for the Gates Foundation on the project that Saima mentioned. And I'm currently working with a Kenyan startup called Ilarian, and also working on ideation for a new startup that I'm going to be launching. So about this sort of exclamation mark and exclamation point, what I want to say about that is that I feel that there was this promise that technology had, that it was going to democratize access, that it was going to open up this whole new world to people. And it was very sort of world changing, the vision for what tech was going to do, especially in the early to mid 2000s. I graduated in 2005 with my undergrad, in 2009 with my grad. And so it was a time when there was, the Facebooks of the world were just sort of starting out. Facebook launched in 2004. And, Zuckerberg was actually the same year as me at Harvard, at the other school, as we called it at MIT. So, but for me, I think that there was this question that I was asking and this hesitation that I had, which is summarized by someone who is my role model, Jennifer Doudna, who's a chemistry Nobel laureate, one of only 3 women that has ever won the Nobel Prize in chemistry. And she said that she had all these hesitations as a young scientist. And for her, the definition of success in her field was asking herself the question, can I do science that I'm going to be proud of? And it was remarkable to me to hear her story and to learn that someone like her at a younger phase of her career had that question that she asked herself about this doubt that she had, that she calls the biggest obstacle in her scientific career, was these doubts that she had about, can I do science that I'm going to be proud of? And can I feel like I've made the right choice with my life, that I decided to do something that I can do well? And as I read her story, I realized that these were the questions that made me pause in this sort of exclamation mark part of my journey, where I was finding it difficult to look at tech. I think now in today's world, it's much easier for people to understand that sentiment of the conflict that one can feel in tech, if you want to make sure that you have positive digital outcomes for people who are using the technology. But at that time, I think it was something that not a lot of people related to, but that I still felt, that I felt that I was what I wanted to call a humanist technologist. And I was sort of making up these terms in my head and thinking about how to really apply my values, my worldview, and my principles in the world of tech. So here I am, reflecting on myself and my work in the world, about my role as a computer scientist, a technologist, and someone who loves to solve problems, loves to, write algorithms that solve problems and have solutions, but that really couldn't imagine how to connect that to the bigger dots. And so these were the questions I was asking myself of, can I do work that aligns with my worldview in tech? And also, why do we need distinctions between tech and ethical tech, between investors and impact investors? And this is a question that I have asked over and over again in my career, where I feel like we do a disservice by making these artificial distinctions and by pretending that tech platforms are neutral, that all of them don't actually have impact. It's either negative or positive. So that's my view. And so I was really sort of confused by these distinctions that I saw between and these qualifications that I saw for tech and ethical tech. So the main sort of the core meat of my talk today, and the concept that I want to come back to over and over again, is of scale, is of what does it mean for a product to scale? When can we say that a product has scaled successfully? And I want to posit that we have been not ambitious enough about what scalability truly means in the context of technology and products. And my definition that I want to propose today and talk about with examples of scale is not just technological, but also social scalability. And what I mean by that is that technology solutions that have favorable digital outcomes for users from all segments of society, for all users, not only for a select group that is privileged, and that can really scale in harmony with the social systems that they inevitably do become a part of, especially as they scale to different parts of the world, to different communities, to different ideologies, to different people with different backgrounds and different resources. So I want to just pause here for 1 second, and Saima, let me know how we can open up the floor a little bit. But I want to invite someone from the audience to tell me what their idea of scale is. What when you look at scale, do you look at something that you think is unconventional compared to the definition we have for scale right now, which is really limited to how many users are using my product?
So people can feel free to either show themselves or unmute or engage in the chat as well. So the question is can you repeat the question again?
The question is, if anyone has any thoughts on what scale means to them, what does it mean for a product to scale successfully? What does that bring up for anyone who wants to share what scale brings up for them?
I think one way of thinking about it would be like scaling both to like different users, but also to different different users might want to use it for different things or in a different way.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. So something that actually gives everyone a chance to use it in their, so something that has that caters to diverse use cases, let's say. That's a great definition. And that's essentially what I mean as well when I talk about scale in terms of having favorable outcomes for users from all segments of society. So the next couple slides are just sort of a recap, right? So I think I don't have to go into a lot of depth here for people with a tech background, even for people not with a tech background, because I think that Facebook as a company, but also several other tech companies that have become sort of beacons of what it means to scale, that have really scaled their products to billions of users, are companies that are rife with issues of their creation that they have failed to address. And that has happened over and over again. I think in the news, it has become part of the news cycle in the last 4 to 5 years. But for people in tech, we've been following this news for at least the last 10 years. And for users such as women and other vulnerable users, they've been warning about some of this for as long as the products have existed. So this is sort of, some of the headlines we've been seeing in the last 3 to 4 years about Facebook. Similarly, but one thing I want to point out is that I think a lot of the positioning that some of these stories have around Facebook's negligence have come to talk about how it is perhaps an inevitable outcome of the capitalist economy that we are a part of. And I think one interesting angle that I definitely connect with and agree with that has come up recently, in addition to this sort of negligence, is that some of it is now actually veering off into criminal activities. So for example, there are cases that Facebook has that qualify now as securities fraud and advertising fraud and investor fraud. And I think this is important to consider as we go deeper into this talk. This is, sort of a corollary, just Google in the same sort of lens of, particularly in the context of its ethical AI program, which was sort of imploded in a way earlier this year after the firing of its co-lead of ethical AI, Timnit Gebru. And so I think that it's important to consider, beyond the headline, sort of the things that we're going to talk about today, which have to do with, so these are some of the bigger and broader questions in tech about how do we structure, organize, and govern global information and communication spaces in ways that sustain us. But I think what I really want to focus on in my talk as a technologist is the product, the tech, the editorial, and the business decisions that led to some of these headlines that we're looking at. So, this is sort of just at the point where it is sort of gaining the type of prominence where there's public outrage and there's legislative, action now being taken against some of these companies. But let's, sort of backtrack. One of the reasons that I really want to, focus my talk on big tech, even though this, this series and my talk in general is about technology and product development and product engineering. But the reason that it's really important to look at these companies is that they are sort of, the gold standard for achieving scale in tech. And they are, the scale at which they operate is something that is comparable to the GDP of some countries. In fact, of I think 3 or 4 of the top economies in Europe. And so it's important to consider the scale at which they're operating so that we can really understand the scale of the problems as well that then, are exacerbated by these companies. And the bottom right graph sort of really shows the increase in growth just within the last calendar year at these top 5 companies. So I want to start with something that I alluded to earlier, which was that platform neutrality is a myth, and that platforms that are used by billions of people carry an inherent culture and architecture that is derived from the product decisions that are made by the teams, and that in turn drive the outcomes for the users. And the drivers of digital outcomes that I want to focus on are 3. One is product engineering. That'll be the meat of the core of what I talk about, which includes the development of the product, the design, and the algorithmic decisions. And then I'm going to touch briefly on startup culture, particularly rewards and penalties that exist in the startup culture. From the investment side, from the startup side, I obviously have gone through those cycles myself. And I think it would have been difficult for me to understand how much these expectations and norms that are set by investors and set by boards and set by startup, founder peers, and the culture that operates in the industry is sort of almost a forcing function for how you build the product in the business. And then business models, very briefly, which is a very, very hairy topic. So I'm not going to go into too much detail there, but a lot of this talk is going to focus on how product engineering drives digital outcomes and how much control actually and how many tools we have at our disposal as technologists to drive these outcomes in a more positive direction. So when I say product engineering, it's a broad term, and it's, usually it includes sort of everything from product development, how code is written, how testing and QA protocols are, what design choices are made, what architecture decisions are made, and what algorithmic choices are made. And so I'm going to talk about that not in a manner where I sort of show from examples from products that we've all seen and used how these decisions guide digital outcomes for users. And my hypothesis here is that the technology is really doing what it was engineered to do, and it's not sort of some of the language that gets used in the industry often talks about how the outcomes that we're seeing are inevitable and unintended. So the term unintended consequences is used a lot, but I want to actually propose that it's something that is a lot more intentional and conscious, and that the technology is doing what it was very consciously, deliberately, and carefully designed and engineered to do, and choices that were made to move it in that direction. Product development, already spoke about this, but this is sort of, areas that have to do with how the product is actually built and coded. Product design is an area of product engineering that I think is super critical. That includes things like what features, your product has that you've decided that it should have. Obviously, your UI, UX, your choice of where things are placed, what text is used, and what default settings you have for users. And very importantly, I think user settings. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about how what users can control has a huge impact on how the product is used, and how it becomes sort of a power imbalance between tech companies and users. And then pop-ups, nudges, menu items, etc., and how all of these have really great influence in shaping behavior of users and building culture online. And then product algorithms, as we all know. I mean, some of the ones that we're all really, really familiar with are obviously recommendation engines, how content gets amplified, how users are matched, let's say on dating sites or in gig economy products, how things are optimized, how users or any other players on the platform are segmented and sorted, how content is segmented and sorted. And all of these really dictate how the product is exposed to a user. What do you see when you open the product is really guided by all of these algorithms. So a lot of this is, again, sort of recap for a lot of us, but this is all to say that this is not a passive, inevitable result of technology being used by bad faith actors, but a result of engineering technology without thinking about how it really scales in society. And the proposal is to introduce some friction and to force teams to slow down and to think about the impact of what they're building. So I'm going to talk about sort of, 4 hypotheses or, proposals within product engineering. The first is that product engineering sets online norms. And what I really mean by that is that decisions of all kinds are made by users on screens increasingly. And I find it very interesting that design is taught in CS as sort of a gateway to influencing users to make decisions with favorable outcomes for the company and the product. When we look at how product engineering sets norms, what I mean by that is really, I think a good example is to think about city and urban design, perhaps, right? So street design, public spaces, what is okay and what isn't, what behavior is deemed okay, what am I accountable for? Another good example would be traffic rules or signs that help with road design and safety. So you can have the same car and the same driver driving in a city like LA and driving in a city like Buenos Aires, and probably having very different outcomes potentially because of the environment that they're driving in. And as a result of it, having different levels of safety that they are exposed to because of how the city is designed, because of how the road infrastructure is designed, because of how rules are set, and because of what is visible to them when they are driving. Similarly, there's the example of store layouts and how they affect buying decisions, which is why companies like Unilever will do sort of heat maps of stores and track users and eyeballs about, what happens when we design the store like this? Where do people go? Do they go into this aisle? Do they look on this shelf? So there's just a huge amount of control you realize when you're starting to build technology that you have over how you set norms and how you shape and guide and ultimately influence user behavior. And one of the interesting things I think here that I want to say is that, these digital nudges that might change the choice architecture actually ultimately, whatever you encourage, whatever you reward, whatever you promote, whatever you incentivize ends up becoming the norm, especially when you scale. And then I'm going to talk about a second concept to consider, which is that when it comes to product design within product engineering, we get what we optimize for. And so, as I was saying, UI UX is taught in CS as a gateway to influencing users to make decisions about, where should we place buy buttons and what web layout and calls to action lead users to convert and boost engagement and lead to better customer retention and so on. And we really, this is a science that we understand pretty well and pretty reasonably now. We understand how to control some of these metrics. We understand design decisions that influence some of these behaviors and cause some of these metrics to be more favorable for the company and the business. And what I want to propose is that we dedicate resources to studying how design can influence desirable digital outcomes, can influence positive online interactions, can influence spread of truth and knowledge-seeking behavior, and other things that we would like to see on digital platforms, especially social media. The third thing that I want to talk about is that product engineering can create a power imbalance. This is a really crucial point that has come over and over in my work that I've done in products that I've built, and I'll talk about an example. So, the core concept here is about how much control and decision-making power users have to shape their own experience. Whether it's a news feed, you're looking at Google News or Apple News, and you're able to, let's say, customize your settings and be able to select which publishers you want to see or not. But also, those are some of the obvious ones, but there's really so many more that are sort of a little more insidious that, you can and cannot adjust. And so I think, this sort of lens is really to say that, the more settings that users are able to modify in their, to shape and to sort of design their own experience, the more the less of a power imbalance there is between the technology companies and between users. And another obvious example is when companies started setting algorithmic feeds versus chronological, users were ultimately given control to switch back. It's not straightforward or easy still, in my view, but it exists, right? And similarly, when Facebook started prioritizing video in its field algorithm, or when they started giving preference to user-generated content versus links, can I do anything about it if I value authenticity and quality? Can I, suggest or select that I don't want a particular page recommendation in my feed? Can I, an interesting example here is that Facebook decided to weigh reaction emojis differently. So an anger emoji is weighted 5 times as heavily as a like emoji. And so that obviously changes the type of content that gets amplified, and what control do I have as a user in not wanting to see incendiary content or content that is provoking or enraging. The last point here is a point that has been brought up by people who are full-time researchers in social media, who talk about interoperability and the ability to port. So if I today just decided to close my Facebook account, one of the huge barriers to doing that is that I lose, the capital that I've built up, my social capital, my friends, my network, my pictures, so lots and lots of things that I will lose if I do that. And the fourth and final thing I want to talk about is that product engineering actually seeds and builds user bases of a certain type. Reddit is, as some of you know, a user-generated social news aggregate platform, and it's made of more than 2 million discussion boards called subreddits. And these are communities that allow members to post and comment and vote. And this is a community that came out of, when you look at the founders' backgrounds and when you look at the initial use case, it was a lot of male users who were gamers and who, it was seeded sort of that way. But then beyond that, beyond the seeding of it, there was a product engineering that influenced how these spaces grew and what type of users they attracted and retained. And, part of it, for example, was Reddit's algorithms. So platform algorithms on Reddit acted as gatekeepers of information by suggesting related content and shielding unrelated content to users. This is very common and done obviously in several social media platforms. In this case, it means that users who search for something that is related to one of the many cultural touch points in what has been termed the manosphere may find that their suggested subreddits are influenced by these algorithms. So the social network analysis of the manosphere suggests that Reddit platform algorithms performed exactly as they were designed to do, which is to help people in the network find each other and keep their attention. Reddit may employ these algorithms to grow and sustain the platform, but the consequence is that the manosphere has sort of a network resilience that it's built up, that the more the more it grows in a certain direction, the more it grows in that direction. And so the algorithms that are used to surface the content that users see is very much guided by these decisions, and that help grow the user base in a certain direction. It's interesting when it comes to Reddit, actually, there is an aspect of security that goes into it, where the Homeland Security Affairs published, the Journal of Homeland Security Affairs published research, because there were several terrorist incidents that were linked back to radicalization that happened in these subreddits. And so there is obviously much deeper implications of how these algorithms surface content and connect users and build resilience, if unchecked, that have implications for national security. So I want to take a step back and talk about Twitter, which is the social media platform that most of us use, and I think I use more often. And this is just to sort of say that product design and the features that we take for granted within the platforms are very much they came out of either ideas that users had or ways in which users started to use the product themselves. Robert Anderson was a founding designer of Square. He used the first @mention. Chris Messina at the bottom, who used the first hashtag, is an open source advocate. So he wrote a blog post about this feature, and Twitter didn't implement it at first. But finally, they announced it in 2009, a couple years after he tweeted this. Similarly, threads weren't a feature until 2017. They came out of users that did tweet storms, and Mark Andreessen is the one who sort of made the tweet storm concept famous. And then Twitter threads came into being in 2017. So this is sort of just to show, how some of the stuff that we take for granted really didn't exist, and everything really should be up for question. The fundamentals of product design should be up for question, as well as we discover how they shape user behavior. So at the with the danger of sort of self-promotion of putting my own Twitter bio here, I put this here to sort of help us think about how Twitter, by making the follower number visible, by having a really short sort of bio, what type of behavior and what type of user journey it sort of influences. So if we look at the fact that a 160 character bio really contributes to, I have to sort of present myself as someone that you want to follow in 160 characters, or the value that I have on the platform, or my reputation is linked to a number, which is, the number. When I look at someone's Twitter bio, unfortunately, I have become very accustomed to looking at the follower number as the first thing. And it's interesting to think back to what would happen if that was not so visible, or what if it wasn't, the thing that we gravitated towards, or that was really sort of, front and center and used as a metric for someone's value on the platform. And obviously all of us know incredible people who are academics, researchers, scholars, activists who just don't have that type of following because they haven't figured out how to, build the kind of popularity that is the popularity contest that Twitter is. The idea of the infinite scroll obviously is a design choice as well. The idea of like and retweet is a design choice. That the idea of virality is something that is a design choice that rewards, outrage and attention-grabbing posts. We're competing for likes. We're competing for, but these are all things that we're, almost overly familiar with. But that it would be so interesting to take a step back and think about how it would look if these were not the things we were aligned around in our. So. I want to take so the next thing I want to talk about is that Tracy Chu is someone who experienced immense amounts of online, abuse and harassment on social media herself, and launched a tool called Block Party to combat it. She said that her whole life became oriented around how she can be safe psychologically, mentally, and physically. And I think that the impact of online abuse and harassment is really invisible to people that don't experience it. So there are obviously parties that are much more vulnerable to it, such as women activists, as of 2020, unfortunately, scientists, reporters and journalists. And oftentimes this type of abuse does translate to offline abuse, to actual physical threats or actual physical action as well. And so she's someone who decided that widespread harassment should not be viewed as a price that some users have to pay, but an unacceptable sign of failure for the platform, and that people should be more aware of their data rights and willing to take collective action against tech companies that don't prioritize that. And so she launched this tool called Block Party, which has really gives a lot of control to users in terms of how they interact with unwanted Twitter comments, mentions, abuse, harassment, and so on. So, you have a lockout folder, you can block, and the nuance that it gives you in terms of the type of accounts you can block, and how you can save and customize some of these lists is beyond what Twitter gives you. So it's a plugin that you can use if you are a Twitter user. You can say, I'm open to people. I don't want to hear from someone that doesn't have a profile photo. I only want to hear from people that I've replied to recently. I need a break. And so it's really changed. So Twitter actually now has Block Party on its developer platform as an example of a success story. And recently, Twitter actually adopted one of the features that Block Party came up with, which was to be able to control who can reply to your comments. So this is a small but very impactful example of how someone who was at the receiving end of online harassment and abuse, and the best solutions have come from people who are at the receiving end of it, who have experienced it to a degree that has been disruptive for them. And Twitter has fortunately, after quite some time, adopted this. But the question that I want to ask is, why could Twitter not have done this themselves, right? So I think that's the question that we should ask is, whose needs and preferences and whose safety is being centered on a platform like Twitter? And why did Tracy Chu have to go and start Block Party for Twitter to then have the idea that they could also actually do this, right? The second example I want to talk about is Facebook pages and Facebook instant articles, which is, in my view, an example of engineering products that are particularly optimized for bad actors. So Sophie Zhang is a Facebook whistleblower from, I think, 2017 or 2018, much before Frances Haugen of this year. And she talked about the case of page abuse. So Facebook, when you have a Facebook user, so again, this is again in the realm of sort of product decisions or design or engineering decisions that Facebook has made that have contributed to how bad actors, how much room bad actors have to sort of how much control and room and how much space for exploitation Facebook gives them. So if you're a Facebook user, as a Facebook, to create a Facebook user account, you cannot have more than one. Facebook will check for authenticity that you're a real human user. And obviously with that account, you can like, share, comment, react, etc., and post and do all these things as a user. Facebook pages, to create a Facebook page, which gives you the same user function and privileges as a user account, one user can start unlimited number of pages and there are no authenticity checks. So this one user being able to start unlimited number of pages is actually a very, very impactful design decision that led ultimately to some really, really egregious, horrific, at scale issues that happened around the world. And I'm going to quickly sort of show that right now. But what Sophie Zhang calls it is page abuse. So this is a design feature. The fact that I, as one user, can, if I want, create 1,000 Facebook pages. It's a design decision that has implications that come under what she calls page abuse. So this is a Facebook post on Azerbaijani news page Azad Soz, which is an independent media outlet in Azerbaijan. It's about activists being sentenced to prison for writing pieces of Azerbaijani politicians. More than 1,000 people commented on the post, mostly in support of the government. But if we dig further, something suspicious is going on. So the top comment that you see at the bottom is from someone named Zeynep Babayeva. And she's got the sort of the most upvoted comment on this. And if we click through to her profile, we learn that it's not a user account. It's actually a page for a coffee shop. And it was made a few days before the comment was posted. And so what, whoever created this page, what they can do is just create multiple Facebook pages, posing as users, not real humans, collect images and sort of just, post. So here, for that particular post that I showed you earlier on Azad Soz, these are the top 301 comments on the post, just the top 301 of them. How many do you think are from pages set up to look like a user account? Any guesses? Anyone want to have a random guess?
We have a guess in the chat, 250.
It's pretty good. It was 294 out of the 301. So all but 7 of those, comments, the top 300 comments, were actually from accounts that were fake, that were pages that were set up. And all of them were less than 1 year old as well. So using this feature, and this particular post is part of the campaign that I'm going to talk about, but in 2019, over a 90-day period, an organized campaign to harass and silence journalists produced 2.1 million negative harassing comments on Facebook pages of opposition leaders, independent media outlets, accusing them of being traitors and praising the country's autocratic leader, Ilham Aliyev, and his ruling party. And so essentially, Facebook was being used to prop an authoritarian regime with an egregious human rights record. And Facebook at the time, in August 2020, actually, Facebook had 0 employees or contractors known to speak Azeri, and it took them several months to look into it, and close to a year for an investigation to even begin. So this is all, again, to say that, these are loopholes in design and product decisions that left this, gaping hole in how users are able to interact with Facebook, how they're able to create fake engagement, and how Facebook is now being used by is used for state-led political manipulation by presidents and prime ministers around the world. Another example of this is the Honduran president, Juan Hernandez, and his administration. 90% of all known civic engagement was driven by him in the country. Civic fake engagement was driven by him in the country. And over a 1 month period, 78% of the likes and engagement that he received on his Facebook posts were fake. So the reason I'm quoting these statistics is to show that this is not an isolated incident. It's not even that some part of the engagement here is fake. It's that the majority of it is fake. And I think this is a telltale sign when your product starts being used in a way where majority of it is negative when it comes to vulnerable communities, vulnerable countries, vulnerable users. That is a product failure. That is a product design and development failure, that there's a loophole that you left open where a majority of what you see is now not actually how the product was meant to be used. And these are, again, just numbers to show at the bottom on this black box, if you see. Again, we all know this, but Facebook does shape our perception of public opinion. It shapes, if we think a political leader is popular, that really might be a mirage if we're seeing it on Facebook. But on the day that Sophie Zhang was fired, she documented the number of fake or suspicious accounts that were boosting politicians as the numbers that you see on the screen. And these are just the accounts. And each account potentially could be running hundreds or thousands of, further pages that pose as accounts. And one sort of, thing that I want to bring up here is sort of how personal this is for me. So I'm active in the activist circles in Pakistan, in the feminist circles in Pakistan. And in March of this year, there was a campaign, a doctored video that floated around on Twitter that was used to accuse the organizers of the Women's March in Pakistan, called the Aurat March, of blasphemy. Blasphemy is a crime in Pakistan that is punishable by death, and it's something that has been weaponized by the government and by political parties for several decades in the country's history. Now, I think the reason I bring it up is that what I noticed in that sort of tweet storm that followed as a result of that video being shared on Twitter was how little control the women activists had over, so we reported accounts, we, tried to sort of, some of us went underground, sort of like put a black picture on our profile picture, changed our names and so on, or deactivated our accounts, temporarily. But so much of it had to do with the fact that a lot of this harassment and abuse is cross-platform, and there still don't exist easy or intuitive or simple ways to even report abuse. And it takes a very long time for abuse to be for the cases to be sort of investigated and closed, and by that time the damage has been done. So the final example that I want to talk about very briefly is that it's not just that Facebook and Google are amplifying some of this fake engagement. It's that they're actually now funding this misinformation. So this is a very recent article just from a week ago, which talks about how, which essentially talks about how over the past, several years, sorry, just switching back my screens. So what this talks about is what has led to the creation of what we call troll farms, which were critical in the Russian campaign that influenced US elections in 2016. And troll farms are a loosely defined set of Facebook pages that run out of the Balkans and that target foreign audiences. Now, Facebook and Google as so these troll farms actually reach 140 million users monthly before the 2020 elections, and 75% of their reach is users who never followed the page. So I think this point of how the recommendation algorithm actually pushes people to follow these pages that don't actually exist as a result of them following it, and also that so much of the direct income of bad actors and troll farms is now coming directly from Facebook and Google. So as a way to sort of show how monetization schemes created by Facebook were directly paying some of these troll farms, I use the example of Instant Articles. So Instant Articles is basically a natively hosted news solution that Facebook came up with in 2015. And this is a chronology that shows how in Myanmar, 6 of the 10 websites in Myanmar that had the highest engagement on Facebook were from legitimate media, went to 0 by May 2017. So in May 2017, it went, after Instant Articles was launched as a product, legitimate publishers accounted for 2 of the 10 sources and then accounted for 0 of the 10 sources. And this is again to say that, in a country where Facebook is synonymous with the internet, low-grade content had overwhelmed other information sources, shifting public opinion, inciting people to actual action, escalating violence, such as the Rohingya genocide. And so there are, again, design and product decisions that lead to a rapid degradation of the digital environment of these countries, and eventually also of publishers leaving, actually. So Instant Articles is a product that is relatively new, but we don't have time to go into the monetization scheme that Facebook came up with, but it was essentially an attempt for Facebook to control more ad space by saying, instead of you clicking out, from the link to New York Times or Washington Post, you can view it natively within the article. We'll reformat it for you. And one of the design decisions they made was that any fake news site, which I might be able to recognize if I actually go out to the news site, versus by how it's formatted, the spelling mistakes, the ads that come up, the design choices, it's just not well done, or it has a lot of errors. might not be able to recognize anymore when it is natively within the Facebook app reformatted to look uniform. So a New York Times website piece and a fake news, made up sort of news publication will look exactly the same in terms of like the homogeneity of the format and all of that within instant articles. And so I think this is a question that I ask myself after all of these examples is, can we really say that Facebook succeeded in scaling when this is the outcomes, the digital outcomes that we are seeing around the world after people use Facebook's product at scale? Again, at the, at the risk of putting my own tweet here, I actually find it to be a very pessimistic worldview. To imagine that a highly profitable business model cannot exist outside of organizing, engaging, exploiting humans around hate, outrage, violence, abuse, harassment, propaganda, clickbait, and posturing. I have a much more optimistic view of business and technology, and I think we have examples now to show that that is true as well. And I want to end by talking about what the focus of my work is, which is building inclusive products. Ellen Pao, who is the ex-CEO of Reddit, said that companies will take these issues more seriously if their leadership looked more like the people being harassed or impacted or influenced. So, I'm here talking to you today about this because what happens in countries like Honduras and Mexico and Indonesia also happens in Pakistan, which is my home country. I've seen it firsthand, and it means something to me. I've built technology products and seen what happens when design decisions are not thought through carefully. And I can guarantee that if Facebook had a board member who, was from Honduras or even from any sort of at-risk country around the world, we would not be saying this is just profit maximization. There would be a mental calculation here that would be a little bit more nuanced than what we've seen. So this is where building products for inclusivity becomes important. To imagine a digital world in which everyone can benefit from the technology and everyone has the right to be online without fear of harassment, abuse, and exposure to a lot of the negative digital outcomes of these platforms. If we think of my personal example, obviously, is with gender. It clearly is not only about gender, it is about so many other intersectional points of vulnerability. But if we imagine all the women that have been chased off platforms, many of which I know personally, that are not engaged in the digital world, maybe they haven't set up online retailers or started blogging or run for office or created a YouTube channel because they worry they'll be harassed. This becomes a civil rights issue. And at the bottom, I show how Ellen Pao taking over as Reddit was the first time that the company actually attempted to confront the misogyny and abuse that had become part of Reddit DNA. So I think inclusive products are built by inclusive teams, and a more equal internet would not just be good for women and vulnerable parties, but really be good for everyone in a way, right? Where we imagine that there is more views, points of view that are being surfaced, more ways in which products are being used, a more cooperative, a more democratic, digital world that mirrors the inclusion that we want to see in the physical world. The book that I've put on the right is something worth looking into, which is written by Emily Chang, called The Brotopia, which reflects the degradation, actually, the negative progression of the tech industry in particular, which has been one of the most unequal and non-inclusive industries, and yet one of the most wealth-creating industries. And so leaving behind just huge, huge chunks of people from that wealth creation. This is, a very incomplete, very incomprehensive product engineering cheat sheet, but I feel like there are areas where you can really think about what are the rewards and penalties, what is the behavior that you're encouraging by rewarding or penalizing certain behaviors. Thinking about risks, what can be abused, will be abused, and will become the norm. So what are the risks that you should be thinking about? Thinking about your users, and like one person said at the beginning, what use cases are you really thinking about? And then thinking about culture, similar to how we build physical culture in our cities, in our countries, in our communities, in our companies, in our corporate culture that we think of. It's important to start thinking about digital culture and the culture that we are creating because of the manner in which these products are being built. The last thing I want to talk about is almost sort of doesn't need to be said, but I think that so much of this way of building comes from the conventional wisdom that has come to dominate the startup world, which is about a default to speed, which is about a default to growth at all costs. And this costs is the cost that we talked about earlier, is the costs that are paid by vulnerable users, by at-risk countries, by at-risk communities. And what we valorize, what we glamorize, what we reward, who had the largest round, who was the first, to do XYZ, and so on and so forth. So I end here. It was a little rushed in the end, but I do want to leave a few minutes for people to comment, ask questions, and reflect on what they heard.
Thank you so much, Saba. That was really great. You gave us a lot to think about. And so while people are thinking, I just wanted to throw something out there. So you talk a lot about design. I feel like it's one of your central points to think about the design of product engineering from the start to finish, and how we need to think about the algorithms and how the platforms are basically catered to users on the front end, and what kind of inequities arise from that. So my question is, at what point do you think is the most useful to address these issues around design? Like, where should that begin? Should that begin at the point of education, or within these tech companies? Where do you think that it would be most useful?
As early as possible. As early as possible. So certainly in computer science programs, I feel like there's a huge gap in terms of how computer science is taught, and how these questions are sort of an afterthought, are sort of, on the peripheries, existing for some people to think about. But I think when it comes to within product development, right, it actually, for companies at the idea stage. So for example, Airbnb is a company where one of the well-respected investors in the Valley, Chris Sacca, decided not to fund Airbnb way early on, because he said, guys, someone's going to get raped or killed, in terms of how you're imagining this. And now there are exposés that have come out about how many millions and millions of dollars have been paid out every quarter, every year to people who have. So I think at the idea stage, at the development stage, I actually think that companies like Facebook are, a lot of people think they're at the point of no return, because they're in this sort of stakeholder trap that they've built. So if you reward a certain behavior for long enough, you actually self-select a group of users that are skewed towards a certain type of behavior, and then it's really, really hard to backtrack from it. So as early as possible.
Are there any other questions? Again, you can feel free to unmute yourself. Oh, we have a question from Monique Tate, who's asking, is there anything we can do to verify if the news/information we're reading is authentic? Yeah,
there's a lot of plugins actually now that you can install. If you search on the Play Store or the App Store, you'll see. I wish I had a slide that. But I think if you do a search, there is stuff that will try to objectively rank news by its objectivity, by its reliability, by the source, and so on and so forth. That's probably the best I can offer, but there are plugins, and there are also, me personally, I also spend a lot of time curating my own sources on Twitter, discovering a lot of new independent publications beyond the mainstream. But yeah, I think it's evolving. There aren't any big or obvious answers to that.
We have a question from Boson, who had to leave early, but he was asking, when you were discussing social scalability, do you distinguish between social scalability and inclusivity?
No, I think inclusivity is a prerequisite for social scalability, in fact, right? So building a product that is inclusive of various sectors, segments, needs of society is what I mean by social scalability. It's one of the elements of a product that is socially scalable, in my view.
Any other thoughts or questions? So we have a question from Nina, who is asking, you talked about algorithmic bias briefly. I'm writing my thesis on this and would love to talk to you more. One question I'm grappling with is how these biases make their way into algorithms and how we can communicate / expose these forms of biases to end users.
Can you repeat the final part? How we can expose them to users?
End users, so basically on the front end for people who are using platforms.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who've done some excellent work on this. There's Sophia Nobel, who's written the book Algorithms of Oppression that I highly recommend. So look her up on Twitter, look up her book, look up her work. She also won the MacArthur Genius Grant recently on her research. There's podcasts on this as well. If you search for algorithmic bias. My own work doesn't center so much on that as it does on just thinking about product design elements, features, etc. Of course, this is all part of it, but I think it's really, I mean, it's really baked into and really a part of the systems that we are building and that we're operating in. And so, yeah, I mean, I think Timnit Gebru is another person that I, respect who's done work on this. So yeah, I'm pointing you to other people because my work doesn't, focus so squarely on it. But obviously feel free to email me if you'd like to chat more.
Are there any other lingering questions or comments before we let Saba go? Okay, so one more question from our postback, Zoe. Zoe, would you like to ask this yourself or do you want me to read it?
I can unmute. This is a little rambling. I guess I'm just wondering, right, it seems like there are a lot of sort of issues, as Saba said, that are sort of foundational to a lot of platforms that, as she mentioned, get rewarded and then reproduced. I mean, it seems like a lot of the time, social media platforms try to backtrack or by having these sort of plug-in features that say like, oh, well, we're Facebook, right? We have a lot of issues with information, but we'll add this fake news warning. So I guess I'm just wondering, and maybe this is more with respect to information, how we make sure that those, or how we interpret those sort of band-aids that large social media platforms feature, or like a plugin for a news source. How do we make sure that those don't reward monopolies on knowledge? And still preserve sort of independent sources. Does that make sense as a question? I don't know if that was clear. I can rephrase.
Yeah, the final part was a little bit unclear. Like, are you saying that these sort of whack-a-mole strategies or band-aid strategies are not solving the problem? Or
well, yeah, I guess I'm just thinking that, for example, and I'll just like make up a website. For example, if you have this social media platform where the issue of sort of knowledge and I'll say like fake news, where that's a big issue. And then you have some plugin that says, well, this is real news, like that legitimizes different sources. How do you make sure that's not just legitimizing sources that have a monopoly on information? Like, for example, like I mean, obviously the New York Times has some really good journalism, but I think that it has a lot of issues in how it reports certain topics. So for example, if this plugin is just saying, well, it's the New York Times, so it's good, how do you make sure that independent perspectives are still preserved?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's sort of the next level and another layer of what we have to think about, right? Which is that it's not only about, it's about the quality and the nuance, and it's also about the headlines that we write. It's also about the fact that ultimately so much of mainstream media has been hijacked by what has been called media capitalism, right? So it is the ad economy ultimately that controls sort of the eyeballs and the competition of eyeballs. And so a lot of legacy publishers or mainstream, publishers that we trusted, the quality has been going down in recent years because of sort of, the metrics that they're aspiring to as they go digital, especially native digital sites. So, I mean, I think this is a great question. I don't think there's an easy way to draw that distinction, but I do think that there is a need for surfacing more independent news sites, and funding some of them. I mean, there are people who think that this is a public-private problem, where public media in the US, when it comes to developed economies, is one of the most underfunded for the developed world. Like, the US is an anomaly in how little money goes into funding independent and public sources of media. So I think this is a much bigger problem than tech. But I think when it comes to tech, you've very much hit the nail on the head, that this is a sort of this whack-a-mole strategy, and it doesn't really, neither does it solve the problem, nor does it address this more nuanced issue or problem that you've identified, which is that it's not just about being New York Times. And if we're only checking for facts, like, is this actually, because I mean, even when it comes to fact checking, there's so many levels of it, right? So something can be an outright lie, something can be an exaggeration, something can be an urban legend, something can be, so there's so many levels of it. And I think that the opinions that we read, the analysis that we have, really shape who we are. And it's ultimately about the quality of journalism degrading as a result of the business models that have come to dominate it, right? So yeah, I wish there was an answer to your question, but I think that is exactly the question we should be asking.
I love that. Is there any other question or comment? We're a little bit over the hour. So if there aren't any more questions, then I'm gonna thank Saba for her time and for joining us and putting together this fantastic talk. And there are some people who have asked for your contact information. So if you're interested in connecting, just email us at csc@barnard.edu and we'll pass on your information. You can follow Saba on Twitter, and this talk will be recorded and posted by next week. So you can watch it again if you'd like. Thanks again, Saba, for joining us. I really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for watching.